please help me welcome Dr. Aaron Corrales-Diaz.
Thank you. So I am pleased to be here with you all tonight and to have the great pleasure to introduce our guest speakers, Jan Postma, the Chief Financial Officer of the Museum of Modern Art, and Jane Panetta, Associate Curator of the Whitney Museum of American Art for the Johnson Collection's Voices in American Art series. This evening marks the third installment of this educational series designed to engage the Spartanburg community on the subject of fine art in America. Given their achievements in the field and their local roots, Jan and Jane were ideal candidates for keynote speakers, and we are grateful to have them, and to their daughter Lily, for making the trek to the South to be with us. Now, I have been given quite the task to summarize the accomplishments of our two speakers tonight, as their resumes are both extensive and impressive. Jan Postma, a proud 1995 graduate of Spartanburg High School, has been with the Museum of Modern Art since 2001 and was named Chief Financial Officer in 2008, a rather remarkable feat for the ripe old age of 31. Prior to joining the museum, Jan worked in investment banking at Merrill Lynch. He received an MBA as a Baker Scholar from Harvard Business School and a BA degree in economics, summa cum laude, from Williams College. Jan recently completed the necessary coursework for an MA in art history at Hunter College. Equally accomplished is his wife, Jane Panetta. Jane joined the Whitney's curatorial department in 2010 and has been promoted several times, most recently to associate curator in 2015. She served on the curatorial team for America is Hard to See, the 2015 inaugural exhibition in the Whitney's new building. Jane also co-curated Signs and Symbols and worked closely on Robert Irwin, Scrim Veil, Black Rectangle, Natural Light. Prior to joining the Whitney, Jane spent 5 years in MoMA's painting and sculpture department, where she worked on the exhibitions James Ensor and Richard Serra sculptures 40 years. Jane holds a BA in history from Haverford College and an MA in art history from Hunter College. This evening, Jan and Jane will explore the idea of a museum collection, different approaches to collecting both historically and today, and the myriad of ways in which museum collections are used to create a powerful impact. Drawing both on their own professional experiences as well as other examples, they hope to engender an active dialogue around the importance of art and art collections. Such a topic is a relevant one for the burgeoning art resources here in Spartanburg. And I'm very excited to hear what our speakers will have to say tonight. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jan Postma and Jane Panetta.
Hi, everyone. Wow, it's an intimidating crowd tonight. It's always tougher speaking in front of people you know. And Jane and I quickly realized after we wrote our synopsis of our talk that, in fact, we were going to have to narrow it down a little bit. I think we were a little too ambitious for an hour. So we hope you enjoy what we have to say. And what we've tried to do, in fact, is divide this into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to give a broad overview of how MoMA has used its collection over time. And in the second part, Jane, who was really involved in the Whitney's recent reinstallation, one of the most talked about shows in New York this past year, is going to give a more specific look at how that collection was reinstalled and used. And we hope we'll have a little bit of fun, and we'll see how this goes. Thank you. So I wanted to start off actually just thinking about this concept of collection. What does it actually mean? And what's interesting is you look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and a couple of things stand out. First of all, collection was actually coined in around 1387. And museum, the word museum actually did not originate until 200 years after that. So one of the things we hope you gather from this talk is the idea that a collection can be distinct from a museum, a specific building, or a place. And I think that's something we wanted to underscore. And the second thing here is that a collection is a group of objects viewed as a whole, and that's something that Jane will talk about a lot when we think about reinstalling the Whitneys collection. But the idea of collecting, particularly collecting art of the recent past, is a very new one. In fact, it wasn't until the 20th century that museums really broadened beyond this idea of just a cabinet of curiosities or just simply classifying knowledge. And so that's actually interesting to think about as well. And in fact, it was in 1929 that MoMA was founded. And I want to just pause on this slide for a couple of minutes and underscore a few things about the idea of the Museum of Modern Art, which I think are important. First of all, if you look at these images on the screen, the first thing, or probably not the first thing you all notice, but one of the things that you may notice is that the entrance here is directly on the street. And that's actually a huge statement, because what MoMA was trying to say was that anyone can come off the street, enter this collection, this museum, and enjoy modern and contemporary art. And it's a very powerful statement, and one we still believe in to this day. And then that idea of just welcoming anyone, even though we think today of modern art as this highbrow elitist thing, the concept is actually really against that. It was more about people can come in at any time and enjoy the art on view. And then when we look at the original mission statement, which the founder and recast in 1944, it was to help people enjoy, understand, and use being a key word that I'll come back to, the visual arts of our time. And I have arts of our time underlined too, because it's very easy to think of art or collecting into this very narrow painting and sculpture bucket. And in fact, most of the objects that I'm going to show are not painting and sculpture objects. MoMA has a very broad definition of visual art, encompassing everything from painting, sculpture, photography, film, to even video games more recently. And this idea of art being available to anyone is super important. Mayol was one of the first artists to enter MoMA's collection in 1930. And what's amazing about this is that this work, commissioned later in 1938 and completed in 43, is still on view in the MoMA Sculpture Garden today. It's a beacon of familiarity. If you're coming to the museum for the first time, you'll notice it. If you're coming back, it'll always be there. And I think that's again, something to help anchor people's visit to MoMA. And since the early collecting period, sorry, I'm the CFO, so I had to include like a data slide. I don't expect everyone to understand this, but a couple of things I want to point out here is, and this is actually a public data set that MoMA releases, and there have been some interesting articles about it. But essentially, what you see is that each year, the way these axes work is the x-axis on the bottom is the year the artwork was produced, and the y-axis is the year you acquire it. So there's this very high density on kind of the far right of the slide here. And what that is showing you is that MoMA is just very actively acquiring and contemporizing its collection. In fact, we acquire an average at least one work per day, which is kind of an extraordinary view. And these works range from things that are very familiar to everyone. I hope most people recognize the artist on this page. Jasper Johns, also in the Johnson collection here in Spartanburg, and of course a great Southern artist. But we're not going to spend a lot of time on these classics, as well as works of art that are harder to understand. And here on the left is simply a snow shovel. This is rated high at MoMA in terms of one of the most perplexing pieces for people to understand. But this is important because we don't expect actually every visitor to have a positive reaction to this bit of the collection. In fact, if you have a visceral negative reaction, that's actually good too. The point is to have a reaction. Going back to this idea of enjoying the art, whether positively or negatively, is super, super important. And of course, Duchamp, that work on the right, not in MoMA's collection, but I wanted to show it anyway. This is obviously a standard issue American urinal. Flipped on its side. And a British newspaper did a survey of art historians in England in 2004, and this was actually named the most influential work of modern art. But if you think about it, it's not that surprising, right? Because the British have always really been jealous of American plumbing. So you see, So you see that translates even into the art historical field. And then you have, again, trying to broaden everyone's idea of what a collection can be. These are works that are in MoMA's architecture and design department, but are in fact also sold in our retail stores. And so anyone can simply purchase one of these products, and you're actually using modern and contemporary art. Make your coffee and tea, sit in that nice chair, just enjoy it while you're reading the paper. Making coffee is actually tough in our household. Jane and I have very different taste there. Last data slide, sorry. So as MoMA has grown from sort of one object to 200,000 objects, the focus of the collection, and this is an important point, it's really been, the emphasis hasn't been on a specific geography, it's really been about time period, trying to stay current, and so our focus has really been global, and you can just see most of the work we acquire each year is still by American artists, but it really spans the entire world. And I would actually not probably recommend that for most places, because when you're building a collection, focus is often the toughest thing, and just having the ability to say no, and that's why when you think about the fact that there's modern and contemporary art museums in almost every city in the country or internationally now, the question is how many more of these do we actually need? And it's really refreshing when we think about a place like the Whitney focusing on American art, the Johnson collection focusing on Southern art. This kind of focus is super, super important as you're thinking about building and even using a collection. I'm now going to transition a little bit backwards into really three broad ways in which MoMA's used its collection over time, and I think these are just general ways that most institutions are using their collection, again, not limited to a specific place. And the first is in the building and the surrounding community. From the very beginning of MoMA, crowds have actually been a problem in New York City. It's kind of that old Yogi Berra phrase, no one goes there anymore, it's too crowded. We actually had to raise our admission price as early as 1930, 1 year after we opened, due to overwhelming demand. So we had to charge 50 cents during the last 2 weeks of an exhibit to prevent the crowds. But one of the ways, one of the reasons that there were crowds is because these exhibits were designed to be very accessible, to be open, to be something that anyone could react to. And what you're seeing on the screen here is an installation shot of an exhibition from 1944 called Are Clothes Modern? This concept that clothes could be part of a modern and contemporary art collection was definitely in keeping with the original mission of MoMA to have a very broad definition of the visual arts. And you'll, just to read from the press release, it says, the exhibition throws light upon a great number of mystifying, humorous, or shocking habits. It shows the present overburdened by the past, a needless waste of materials, and a superfluidity and obsolescence of detail, as well as arbitrary or uproarious malformation. It all forms a maze of the irrational and the accidental, a maze from which it is time to escape. So a very provocative statement around clothes. And that quote that you can see on the back of the wall there, very anachronistic gender view. It says, the more helpless a woman, the more attractive she is supposed to be to man. To keep her from moving freely, he hampers her walk with anklets, stilts, hobble skirts, and high heels. This was just an example of a very popular exhibition in 1944 that, again, anyone could enjoy. You didn't have to have this comprehensive background of modern and contemporary art. But what MoMA quickly realized, and I think what a lot of places have realized, is that a building or being in a place just isn't enough. And so we started building up an active circulating exhibition program, and I'm showing two images from something called New American Painting, which was sent from MoMA to Europe in 1958 and 59. We know this today more by the term abstract expressionism. But this idea of broadening the impact beyond the community you're with by circulating your exhibitions around the world is one that's still powerful today. And in fact, this was actually part of a larger, many have said that this was part of a larger cultural diplomacy around the Cold War, just this idea of exporting American values. Even though this painting is by definition apolitical, a lot of the write-ups for the show emphasize the uncompromising individualism of the artist, and which was a very American thing at the time. And interestingly enough, MoMA actually did not do another synthetic painting show until just last year. So a huge amount of time elapsed between when this was circulated in 1958 and 59 until when painting itself was tackled again. And one thing I want to note, again, just circling back to the amazing resources here in Spartanburg, I was astounded in talking to David and Aaron and Lynn in terms of the Johnson collection. Right now, they have some of their exhibitions are planned on tour to 17 museums around the country, which, when you think about this idea of not being limited to place and having an impact more broadly, that's an extraordinary number. So let me turn now to the third leg of really how collections are used. We talked a little bit about this idea of place, then the way exhibitions could circulate around the world, but increasingly, really since the invention of the internet, it's also been about making an impact of your art online and using that as a medium. And increasingly, that's what we've done. What you see on the screen is from one of our more recent shows called the Jacob Lawrence, the Migration Series. And that actually will be on view in Washington, D.C. at the Phillips Collection starting in October for those who want to see it. And some of these images are extremely powerful. I mean, this was an image made in 1941. You see the caption there. One of the largest race riots occurred in East St. Louis being basically where Ferguson is today. Again, an example of a work from the past really speaking to us through a contemporary lens. But the real highlight here is where this had the broadest reach was a very detailed and in-depth website we created for it. And you can find it just at MoMA.org, the Migration Series. So if you miss seeing it in person, that's okay. You may not have the same emotional resonance, but you could at least view the images online with research material. And I think that's really, if you want your collection to have an impact, that's the way to do it. And while I was thinking about this, I also, what struck me was really here in South Carolina, the recent tragedy in Charleston and the artistic response to that. And again, looking at a work from the past, this is actually from the Johnson collection by Anna Taylor called Promised Land Church, which I understand was one of the most commented and engaged upon works after the emotional events of Charleston, even here. And so a local example of really using your collection to have a powerful impact in the visual field, even without being personally on view. And I think this work really speaks for itself. I want to pause for a second before we transition back to where I began. So when we think about the different strategies for how a collection is being used, whether that's in the local community, circulating more widely, or even online, these three words that Alfred Barr started MoMA with, enjoy, understand, and use, I still think are extremely valuable when we think about any work of art in a collection for having an impact on people. And what you're seeing on the screen, I'm sure everyone's wondering what in the heck is going on here. This is a sculpture by Pierre Huy, a French artist, and where the head is actually a live beehive. This was, we worked with a beekeeper in upstate New York to get the bees into place. And when you think about enjoying a work of art, just knowing the backstory behind this is kind of fascinating. There's also a 7.5-hour video on YouTube where you can watch this being. Not a lot of people have made it through the whole thing, but apparently our analytics data suggested that some people had. I don't know who those people were, but it might have been soothing. And we heard the beekeeper remark that he thinks that the bees seem pretty calm being in the luxurious setting of MoMA's sculpture garden. But again, knowing some of these stories make works of art more enjoyable. And then again, understanding. Here, we're using our collection. We have an exhibit up right now called Ocean of Images, New Photography. A work from there is in the top left. But to broaden the effect of that, we also released a textbook at the same time called Photography at MoMA, 1960 to today. And then just last week, launched a free course. Anyone can take this on Coursera. It's in beta testing, probably for a couple more days, but it's there. So if you have an interest in photography, I would encourage anyone in the room to sign up. There's no grades, of course, and it's free. And of course, there's a great quote there for the course: "Photography is a foreign language everyone thinks that they speak." And so true in our Instagram culture of today. And I wanted to close again: enjoy, understand, and use with this idea of use. This is the @ symbol. We all use it every day in email. MoMA actually acquired it into its collection last year. It was one of our most read blog posts. From a financial perspective, it was great. It was free. But again, broadening the definition of art, a very democratic view, anyone can appreciate that this is what an amazing invention. And our curator writes, this was a design decision of extraordinary elegance and economy, repurposing an existing, available, and underutilized symbol to adapt the standard keyboard to a revolutionary new technology. And that's what was amazing about this. At the time, it was one of the least used keys on the keyboard, but of course, not so much anymore. And I wanted to close again, going back to this idea of using collections online. This is an Instagram screenshot from MoMA. And what's interesting about this is a work by William H. Johnson that MoMA acquired just in the last month. The first work by this artist to enter the museum collection. But right here in Spartanburg, in the Johnson collection, there are 4 works by this amazing artist that have been in the collection for some time. And so, what an amazing privilege it is to have access to that right here. And at this point, I'm going to transition a little bit and move beyond what I hope has been really a broad view of collecting, ways to use collections, back to the more specific, and let Jane talk through some of the decisions the Whitney had to make when they were reinstalling their entire collection. Thinking back to that very first slide, a collection must be unified as a whole. And I think that's possibly the toughest thing to do. So let me turn it over to Jane. Thank you.
I'll try not to take offense to the fact that Jan seemed to be suggesting he was going to give the broad brush, big picture thinking, and I was going to deliver some more micro details or something. But anyway, that said, hopefully it won't feel that way. But I am going to talk about the Whitney specifically, and even within that, talk about both the building a little bit, because in this case, I feel like our building and everything we thought about for the new building really related to the collection and our hopes for the collection specifically, and then segue to the opening show that was entirely the collection, and talk a little bit about all the things we tried to do with that show and the ways in which the things we did, the questions it raised, I think will kind of propel the Whitney forward as we move ahead with the collection. So the new building, for those of you that don't know, we opened our new building on May 1st of this past year. This is a picture of the new building. And as I said, we opened with a collection show entitled America's Hard to See that filled the whole building. This was a big deal for us to make this move. This had been kind of in the works for almost a decade, and the building itself kind of underway for more than 5 years, I would say. I think we were able to make the move in a sense based on something that I think was in the Whitney's ethos early on, and that the director always talks about and has talked about, was that the Whitney was never about a building, it was always about an idea. And since the Whitney's founding in 1914, or official founding as a museum in 1931, we've had 4 homes. So unlike MoMA, that's always kind of lived on 54th Street and expanded on that site, we began in the Greenwich Village, then we actually moved to a location on MoMA's site, on MoMA's campus. In 1966, we moved uptown, and then more recently, obviously, moved downtown. So I think something about that ethos, that idea, really enabled us to make this move, which was not insignificant. And just to remind you, this is a picture of both the new building on the left-hand side and the old building that we were in on the right-hand side, built in 1966 by Marcel Breuer. It's on 75th and Madison. So, you know, this slide, without even saying too much, I think says a lot. The old building, the Breuer building, was a fabulous piece of architecture, but it was a very closed building. It really functioned like a bunker. And our director would always say one thing he regretted about that building was when you were in the building, you didn't know where you were. You could be looking at art anywhere. You could be in Munich, in St. Louis, in Los Angeles. There was very little that oriented you to the city. By contrast, I think you can get a sense of this, that our new building is very different than that. It is very much about kind of enabling these views to the city and really kind of engaging with those views, both by enabling people to look into the museum and for you to look out and kind of understand where you are when you're in the space. And this is a photograph I'm taking of the reinstallation of the new building, but again, showing you, I think, this pretty unique relationship between indoor and outdoor space. So when you're in the building and spending time kind of through the galleries, very easily in the course of your trip through the museum, you can kind of slip out and have this outdoor view. You can step out onto a terrace. I'll show you those pictures more, that there would be this constant kind of ongoing fluidity between indoor and outdoor space, indoor and outdoor vistas. So this is a picture, a very famous picture of Peggy Guggenheim's gallery in New York called Art of this Century, and this is a picture from the 1940s. And this space, this installation was designed by Frederick Kiesler. And Peggy's Guggenheim's collection was very heavy in early surrealist work, and surrealism works with kind of these biomorphic forms, and Dali and Juan Miro, those artists. And so this installation very deliberately responded to that art, almost in a kind of exaggerated way, a way that we probably wouldn't be inclined to do now. That said, this was an image we always kind of came back to in presentations when we talked about the new building, that we really wanted the new Whitney to whatever extent possible to be a marriage of art and architecture. And I think kind of a historic example like this, again, an extreme example, provided us a way of thinking about this possibility and kind of staying true to the possibility. So one thing people have often asked me when I've talked about the new building is, how could sort of the preeminent Museum of American Art have hired a non-American and an Italian architect to design the new building? And the building was designed by the architect Renzo Piano, who may be a familiar name to many of you, and who has designed many museums. And that was a very important piece of the decision. When our director and the trustees began to think about who would they enlist to do this, they traveled the world, they looked at museums, they talked to other architects. And the person that seemed to have done the most successful job in terms of what they saw and what they heard, Renzo's name kept coming up again and again. And I'll just quickly show you two examples. This is the Centre Pompidou that he designed in 1977, somewhat controversial at the time. It's in the Marais neighborhood of Paris, and a lot of buildings were destroyed to build it. But I think the relationship between indoor and outdoor space, for those of you that have been there, so you ride the escalators up, you take in these views of the neighborhood and then of Paris, the skyline of Paris, there's this real kind of fluidity between the space. And it also is very flexible gallery. So despite being almost more than 30 years old, almost 40 years old at this point, it's a building that, I think did a lot of things that interested us. And then in the United States, a building that I would say curators really love and artists love to work in is the Neel collection in Houston, Texas. I think it's seen as really a very successful building, how the building kind of falls away and allows the art to sing, and has very flexible gallery space, has skylights, and again, a lot of the signature things that Renzo's been interested in over time. This building is from 1987. We tried to bring to bear on the Whitney. This is Jan's favorite slide in my presentation. This is a slide. So how do you build a new building? And as I said, we really tried to think about the collection a lot. What were the collection needs, and what did we want the galleries to feel like? So, and I think there's been kind of a big burst of new museum buildings in the United States, I say, in the past 20 years, and that seems to be ongoing. And we knew those all hadn't been totally successful. So I would say in our case, we really, to whatever extent possible, wanted to leave nothing up to chance. So to understand the size of the galleries we would want, how wide would we want the floor plates to be? How long? How flexible would we want them to be? How many galleries would we ideally envision on a floor? We found a big space in New York, the Armory building on Park Avenue on the Upper East Side, and spent time with the architects there, mocking up with lasers and tape and things on the floor the potential size of the galleries. People walk the galleries, we cut them up to understand how they would feel for a particular exhibition, and really that was how we kind of came to this decision of what the galleries would feel like, that it wouldn't be just about the site or just about some abstract idea of how big they should be, but what would the experience be, and how big were the biggest works of art in the collection? How could that kind of drive the discussion? And you can see this is on the 5th floor of the museum now, is a almost 20,000 square foot column-free gallery. And I think, understanding how big this space could be really came very directly out of what we did at the Armory. Similarly, we built mock-ups of the galleries in Red Hook, Brooklyn. That's the flooring that's actually in the museum now. It included the ceiling grid, the understanding the relationship between the wall and the floor. And then once that was done, we actually brought artworks. These are 3 artworks from the collection, Carl Andre, Joe Bear, and Andy Warhol. We brought them out to Brooklyn and installed them in the space. So we could understand, okay, how do these works, from different moments look on the floor? How do they look with this particular ceiling height? How do they interact with the ceiling grid? Again, kind of leaving, to whatever extent possible, nothing up to chance. And then, during the process of doing this research, we spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, at other museums, and you can see here we really drilled down with something like ceiling height. I think that became very important to us. We have a collection that spans over 100 years, and kind of the relationship you want to have in a gallery, let's say to a Charles Birchfield watercolor versus a big Richard Serra sculpture, it's very different. You might want a very different ceiling height, very different floor plate. And so we looked at all these different museums, we're in all these different galleries, understanding the ceiling heights, and you can see we recorded this and kind of went back to the things we saw as successful and maybe less successful. And here's a picture of us mocking up the ceiling grid again in Red Hook. So one really important piece of this building versus the Breuer building, I talked about that being very closed. It also had really no outdoor space for sculpture. And I think we have a collection of outdoor sculpture, and we really didn't have a good place to showcase it. It's also something I think we hope to grow. So this is just a shot of kind of both the terraces in the new building, and also these outdoor staircases. Again, really encouraging the visitor while you're there to have the experience inside for sure, but also have the chance to experience art and just to experience kind of vistas of the city. And this is a picture of 3 David Smith sculptures we have on one of the terraces. Again, these are important works in our collection that we rarely had the right opportunity to show up at the Breuer building. So now with this new building, with these outdoor terraces, this enables us to really showcase this artist that we've been very committed to, and this work that he showed outdoors himself. He was always interested in the way this work interacted with natural light. He liked seeing them outdoors in these fields. So, this was an example where we had this work and we didn't kind of have the honest or the right space in which to show it. And the other thing about the outdoor terraces is it was really important to us to have the ability with the windows, have the flexibility to have the terraces function like outdoor galleries. And I'm just showing you here, this is a gallery of minimalist sculpture from the 1960s and 70s. And we had, for the opening show, we had work indoors, but then we also had an important work, a Robert Morris sculpture outdoors. And so we wouldn't have had room to show all of it indoors, but some of the sculpture could go outdoors, so we could have this nice, space indoors, outdoors with this shades up in a way that we absolutely could not have had before. And also, I think seeing something like Robert Morris, he was a sculptor that was very interested in industrial practices and in bringing industrial materials into kind of the fine art conversation. Seeing that against the backdrop of the city, of the urban, seemed particularly fitting as well. And again, here's a Glenn Ligon sculpture, a neon sculpture, Negro Sunshine, which we installed at the end of one of the floors that people could see from all the way down the block. When the trees were not covered with leaves, you could see it from almost 2 blocks away. And so that was an important thing to us, a way to kind of entice people into the building, for people to ask the question, what's going on in there? And that even if you didn't come to the building, you could have some experience of art. And then the last thing we did there's a very large terrace off of the 5th floor, and we commissioned the painter Mary Heilman to do an outdoor installation, if you will, on that space for the opening. And we asked her, it's a big terrace, and we asked her to make kind of a social sculpture. And she made these terrific chairs that she deliberately installed. This is a view from one of the terraces above, and she deliberately kind of installed them as if they were a painting, given the relationships of the colors. But then, of course, people were able to move them around and to experience the space, sit there, look out at the city, and really have a kind of different relationship to the city and to the museum than anywhere else in the building. So now I'm going to segue to the collection and talk to you a little bit about the opening display. The Whitneys collection is much smaller than MoMA's collection. It's about 22,000 objects, but still sizable. And in the Breuer building uptown, for those of you who visited there was limited space for the permanent collection. Unlike a place like MoMA or the Met, where there are many dedicated galleries to the collection, where visitors could return kind of consistently and see familiar friends like Starry Night or Demoiselle d'Avignon. We didn't have that situation exactly. We often use the 5th floor of the building for the permanent collection, but we had nothing dedicated. And I think we began to feel that given the size of our collection, 22,000 objects, we had a responsibility to make a space where more of that could be on view regularly. That, what did it mean for us to have collected that if so little of it was shown so often? So that was a big piece of kind of why we decided to make the move. And as I mentioned earlier, for the opening, there's a lot of discussion, not that I was involved in all of it, but I later learned there was a lot of discussion, what would we open with? And you can imagine there might have been a temptation, let's open with a big Edward Hopper show. Let's open with an artist we're very associated with, a big Calder show, and kind of make a splash that way. But I think the feeling was, given that we had decided to make this move largely to showcase the collection, that what made the most sense was to fill all the galleries, the 4 floors of galleries and the lobby gallery and all the terraces with work from the collection. So that was a big undertaking. Again, unlike MoMA, where so much of the collection or the Met has routinely been on view, for example, that was not the case for us. So there were a lot of unknowns about the collection. People hadn't seen things, things had not been shown. So in order to do this, in order to show the 650 objects through the 4 floors of the building, the 5 floors of the building for the opening, we had to start about 3 years out to begin a very comprehensive look at the collection through the whole span of 115 years. And we did that, and this was somewhat unusual. We did that as actually a large team of 7 curators. And when I was first invited to work at the Whitney full-time, and I was told how many people were going to be on the team, I thought, oh God, that will progress like at a snail's pace. That will be impossible. How will we ever kind of come to decisions, and we'll be arguing? But almost because it was a 3-year process, I think we got into a good groove and really managed to make decisions by consensus. But we really, together as a group of 7, we systematically went through the whole 115 years of the collection, essentially, many hours in one conference room, you can imagine. So one quick thing I'll say, this is the collection ran chronologically from the top floor down, and we titled the exhibition America's Hard to See, and I think this was something we struggled with a lot. It comes from both a Robert Frost poem and an Emile D'Antonio film from the 60s, much more kind of politically charged suggestion through D'Antonio. But I think we thought this worked really well for us for multiple reasons. I think, and I'll walk you through this a little bit, the more we looked at the collection, we noticed that the Whitneys collection had a very consistent, kind of tough political thread through it. There's like early social realist work from the first half of the century, a lot of work from the 60s around Vietnam and the civil rights movement, and then even more recently, I would say since September 11th, a lot of tough work that dealt with what happened at September 11th, the recession, climate change, all of those things. So that the Whitney had really never shied away from that. And I think that we saw as a unique strain of the collection and something we felt was important to reflect in the opening display, that in a lot of ways the collection had functioned as sort of a conscience of American history over the past 115 years. So it felt like a right title in that way. It also felt like a right title because the collection is big and disparate. And as I mentioned, 22,000 objects in the collection. We got that list down to about 2,000 objects that we really wanted to show, but then of course knew we only had room for 650. So what we realized is whole chunks of our collection, whole chunks of history were going to have to come out. So the difficulty of kind of presenting any narrative that was comprehensive was a difficult thing. And so this idea that America is hard to see, kind of any one continuous narrative is kind of an impossible thing to put forth. And I think it was also a title that we thought would signal to people that there would be future iterations of the collection, that it would be it's hard to see, and therefore you need to see more versions of it, so to speak. So, you know, as Jan knows well, we struggled with the title and we struggled with whether or not we'd put the word collection into the title. But I think, as I said, we felt like the show was about our collection, but also kind of about American history and the history of American art in a particular way. So as I mentioned, you'll have to excuse the next few pictures. These are not very good photographs I took on my iPhone, but this is us in storage and a few of my colleagues. And as I said, we spent 3 years on this project and we went through the collection decade by decade. So we spent a lot of time using our digital database to understand, okay, you know, between 1900 and 1910, what do we have? And we looked at those images as checklists, but then we knew we didn't know so many of the works, many things we hadn't shown in decades. So we knew we couldn't just rely on, you know, a tiny JPEG. We would have to go into storage and look at things in person. And so these are photographs from the Whitney storage, and we spent many, many full days there just looking at work after work. And it was so interesting, things we thought would be fabulous that we would absolutely show. Some instances when we saw them in person, we were less impressed. We changed our minds. By contrast, other things that we were not expecting to be so kind of wowed by once we saw them in person, you know, we thought, oh, we're definitely showing this. So it kind of raised a lot of interesting questions for us as curators, as an institution, about the need to kind of make your collection accessible both to the public but to the people working with it, so we kind of know what we're dealing with. And then a couple things in this photograph. Once we did the kind of preliminary pass through the collection, as I said, we got it to about 2,000 objects, and we began to make these boards of different kind of big ideas that you see here. You know, 1950s figuration, 1930s political work, early modern forms, these kind of big ideas that we began to see as chapters or possible galleries. And we put them on these boards and would have these meetings where we kind of debate which works we would keep, which chapters we would keep. And then eventually, of course, we had to turn to the models of the gallery floors, and this is what you see here. And the person in the blue sweatshirt is actually Renzo Piano, and that's one of the reasons I chose this image. One thing that was really interesting and ultimately somewhat surprising to me is the willingness Renzo, the architect, you know, he's a kind of world-renowned, very successful architect, was willing to sit in on some of our conversations. When we began to talk about, okay, the 5th floor, it's 18,000 square feet. We have all these ideas we want to cram in. What's the kind of reasonable number of galleries we could cut this into? And as an architect, he has a kind of natural appreciation, understanding of how to use space in a way we are not architects. We didn't pretend that we had. So we were able to have a really beneficial conversations there. You know, he didn't know that much about the collection, but he was very open without being kind of insistent that we stick with his plan. And I think in the end that really benefited the installation. And you can see this became our war room of sorts, where we spent many full days. These are the boards with these different ideas from the collection, and we spent a lot of time playing with the models. You can see this is our chief curator, just to give you a better sense of these to scale models, which the architects would build for us. And you could see we you know, in designing and understanding the walls, we would put these little maquettes up of the artworks and try to understand, okay, is this enough space from the elevator to the front wall. What kind of experience do we want to have? Is this enough space for this very large artwork? So we really, we changed these walls many, many times. We moved the works around many, many times, but kind of using the maquettes that are to scale and the model to scale became an essential piece of it. So quickly, I'll just walk you through, I'll highlight some of the kind of chapters, some of the galleries in the show. I've sort of weighted this more heavily on the earlier stuff. And again, it was 650 objects, so we could be here all night, which I promise we won't be. So we had a lot of discussion about how we would begin the installation and what did we want to do with that piece of the narrative. And I think we decided that we wanted to talk about the Whitney's founding, which was a unique thing. The Whitney was founded first as the Whitney Studio Club in Greenwich Village in 1914 by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who was a New York socialite who lived uptown. She was herself an artist, but had this sort of bohemian other life, if you will. And the Studio Club was originally founded as sort of more of a social space where there were some exhibitions, there were artist classes, it was a place for artists to gather. And, it was important to us that she was an artist herself, and that she kind of brought that sensibility. We wanted to remind everyone that we began in Greenwich Village, and that in a sense this new building was returning to our roots. And also a reminder that that original 1,000 objects that she collected, that was a personal collection and an idiosyncratic collection in many ways, was the founding collection. And she had never really intended to found the Whitney. She had tried to sell it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art at one point, and they rejected it. And I think this was a moment in New York when kind of all eyes were on the European avant-garde. Alfred Barr and MoMA is, heavily collecting Cubism, Picasso. And so I think she suddenly felt American art specifically needs a home. So she took those 1,000 objects and started the Whitney by 1931. This is a painting of Gertrude on the left. It was a controversial painting at the time. Her husband hated it, the idea that she would be depicted wearing pants, which is kind of hilarious now. And then on the right is a painting of Juliana Force, who was originally Gertrude's assistant, but then became the first director and was really instrumental in kind of shaping the early days of the collection and shaping those early exhibitions. The other kind of obvious thing, but thing we were happy to highlight in this early part of the show, is that a woman director, first woman director and a woman founder. And, that was a remarkable thing, particularly if you're talking about the 19-teens and 20s and 30s. And this is a photograph. This is a painting of Everett Chin, and then next to that is Hopper, and then next to the Hopper painting or Hopper, mostly those are life class drawings. And again, we wanted to show that this was a social space. It was a place where artists came to take classes, and then an artist like Edward Hopper spent years, 5 years, coming to classes at the Whitney Studio Club, and that seemed like such an appropriate thing to kind of highlight given our collection of Hoppers. So we began the narrative with on the top floor with a kind of look at early American abstraction. And, one thing we really tried to do throughout the show, and the reason I'm showing you this slide, was combine icons of the collection. So the painting on the far right is Georgia O'Keeffe's Music, Pink and Blue, a really beloved painting at the Whitney, a painting that we often have on view. Then on the far left is a sculpture from the 1930s by Richmond Barté, an artist also in the Johnson collection, actually, who we collected very early on. We acquired this work in the early 30s, shortly after it was made. But he's an artist that kind of had fallen out of our narrative. So I think we were excited, but also very interested in kind of the modern experience, the connection between modern art and music, in how the body could kind of embody that sensibility. And so this was just one example of where we were kind of bridging the very well-known with things that we hadn't shown in decades and had kind of forgotten about, in all honesty. Another thing I think we really tried to do, again, here's O'Keeffe's Music, Pink and Blue, an artist who many of you may know spent significant time just before she made this painting, actually, in South Carolina, with Marsden Hartley, one of Marsden Hartley's German officer paintings. And I think one thing we wanted to do, and that we saw as a strength of our collection and kind of play out, was a lot of American subject matter. O'Keeffe was looking at the natural world in the United States. Eventually, she goes out to Santa Fe and really responds to that environment very much, and paints New York City. But there are also a lot of painters, early artists, I should say, early in our collection, spending time in Europe. And Hartley spent significant time in Berlin in around 1913, 1914, and falls in love there and makes this series of paintings, of German officer paintings. And he's really responding to artists, German expressionist artists, but also to kind of the vibrancy of Berlin and his ability to be openly gay there in a way he wasn't here. So this slide was just to kind of to highlight this interest we had in kind of the importance of American subject matter, but also the kind of engagement with Europe, with European, with modernism in Europe, and also with kind of the culture in Europe at this time. And then this is a John Storr sculpture. I'm just showing this because we also really try, this is something we haven't shown very often. It's a skyscraper, it's a sculpture of a skyscraper, and it seems so fitting for us to have this kind of against the backdrop of the city. And again, we didn't have opportunities like this in the Brewery Building to kind of play with the vista of the city. And, we also tried to be, playful with the collection in certain ways within the new building. One thing I should mention, these titles that I keep flashing above that I haven't mentioned, these are the titles of the different galleries, and we based all the titles on works that were in the galleries, works from the collection. We didn't want to seem to be sort of superimposing art historical ideas from above. So Breaking the Prairie was the name of a painting in this space, and it was as if to signal subtly that the collection itself had really driven the installation, that we hadn't kind of come at the opening show with an outline, but we had looked at the collection, we kind of let the collection tell the story. What you're seeing here is a photograph by Ansel Adams, probably a familiar name to many of you, and prints by the artist Chiro Obata. And Obata was an artist that was born in Japan and then came and spent time in the United States, spent time out west, Yosemite, met Ansel Adams, and then actually went back to Japan to make these prints in a kind of traditional Japanese printing style. These are new acquisitions for us, and this was an important way for us to kind of expand the definition of American. The more we looked at the collection, we realized, this is a complicated thing. Artists, came here, emigrated here. A lot of artists around the time of abstract expressionism, they were treated as American, obviously. But then, of course, artists have come here and spent significant time here, used American subject matter. Aren't they to be considered American as well? So this was an example of us really wanting to push, especially in this moment, in this kind of very global, connected moment, to kind of push the definition of who is an American artist. And similarly along those lines, that's a Bill Traylor work on the right, another artist in the Johnson collection, and a work by Thomas Hart Benton on the left. Benton, is, I think, really canonized as an important early American artist for his terrific landscapes that he made. This is a double portrait that he made actually in Martha's Vineyard of a deaf couple, the Wests. Bill Traylor is an artist that spent most of his life in Montgomery, Alabama, actually, and didn't kind of become a successful artist much later in his life, but has largely been treated as an outsider artist, which is kind of a complicated terminology that I won't go into. But those outsider artists often kind of stayed outside of the realm of places like the Whitney and MoMA, to generalize. And I think it was important for us in this installation not to do that. And we included artists like Traylor and James Castle alongside a kind of, as I said, canonized artist like Benton, as if to say these artists, there's no reason for them to be out of this narrative. The other thing I'll say is there was a desire in our show to have real geographic diversity. So as much as possible, of course, the collection is in New York and inevitably has a New York bias, as much as possible to have this geographic diversity. So have an artist like Traylor working in Alabama much of his life, or an artist like Benton who is so engaged in a place like Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. Those were important things for us to do and to tease out in the collection. As a reminder that, American art is not playing out in New York. American art is playing out throughout the country. As I mentioned, it was important to us to really include icons of the collection. That Calder's Circus is probably one of the most famous that he made at the end of the 20s into the early 30s. We've talked a lot about how we would display it. We've shown it so often. And so for the opening, we decided for the first time to make a round case for it. And it seems like maybe not a big deal, but aside from the fact that it turned out to be very complicated for the exhibition designers to build this case. But that aside, I think we wanted to kind of encourage people to walk around it in a certain way and to kind of encourage, almost feel reminiscent of the circus tent. So again, we really tried to think about ways to enliven the collection, even the familiar things in the collection in this reinstallation. As I mentioned, we found a real political thread in the collection, and particularly around the time of the 1930s. So post-stock market crash, a lot of depression-related imagery, a lot of labor organizing imagery. This is a painting by Alice Neel of the labor organizer from Baltimore, Pat Whalen, and then also a series of anti-lynching prints made around the time of the 30s as legislation was emerging. There are a lot of these kind of tough images that you can see on the left here. And again, connecting back to this idea of America being hard to see. And I think us wanting to, this was work we hadn't shown kind of in a concentration before. These are anti-lynching prints to the left, and then more labor-related, post-depression-related prints to the right. Again, the Whitney seeming to have a kind of unique collection vis-a-vis the socio-political, and thus really wanting us to tease that as a thread through the show, the 30s, the 60s, the 80s, and the present. And this was a gallery called Fighting with All Our Might that got the most write-ups, I would say, by the press. It was really interesting. I think, given everything, kind of the tumult of things in the United States over the past year, and particularly vis-a-vis race relations, I think these felt like a very resonant gallery. The other thing I think we really tried to do with the collection and with this installation was to have a gender balance as much as possible, and to really seek out female artists that for whatever reason had kind of fallen out of the canon. And this is a painting, and also show things we hadn't shown before. This is a painting made in 1955. We acquired it in 1956, and we'd never shown it. And we didn't. Hedda Stern as an artist is very loosely associated with the abstract expressionists, with their irascibles, but not an artist we knew well. And when we saw this painting in storage, first of all, I think we thought it looked remarkably contemporary. It's made with an early spray painting technique, and we loved that it was of New York. And while much of abstract expressionism is so abstract, it was kind of comfortably referential to the real world. But again, we put this very deliberately right when you walked into the Abex gallery. And so as much as this moment, I think, gets associated with kind of the heroic painting with artists like Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, Mark Rothko, kind of the machismo of those artists in a certain way, we wanted to kind of insert these female artists into the story. And again, here, the de Kooning woman on the left and Franz Klein on the right, two very iconic paintings in our collection, very well-known paintings vis-a-vis abstract expressionism. So we really strove to complicate this story, and this is our Abex gallery. And the other thing I'll quickly mention is the large mural-sized painting on the back wall there is by the artist Lee Krasner, who was actually Pollock's wife, and who lived. Pollock dies tragically in the 50s, and Krasner lives on and continues to paint, and she actually makes this painting when she's able to move into Pollock's studio after he dies. She'd been working in a tiny studio on the property. He had this bigger barn-like studio. He died. She moves in there, and boom, she makes this big painting. And I think for us to have this abstract expressionist gallery dominated by a female artist and by a very strong painting, ultimately, was an important thing for us to do. And this is a gallery of our pop art, and I'll just quickly mention, on the far left is Andy Warhol, the far right is Jasper Johns, but the two middle paintings much lesser known, and that blue painting that you see there is by an artist named Malcolm Bailey, an African-American artist, and this was a painting that he made in 1969, kind of the midst of the civil rights movement, all about the slave trade, and sort of his commentary on the legacy of slavery playing out in the United States even as late as the 60s. I think we liked the way it related to the sort of diagrammatic nature of the Warhol, but again, again, an artist that has really fallen out of the narrative. And this was our desire, as I said, to kind of problematize the story of American art at this moment, to remind people that, pop art can sort of have an apolitical association, yet the 60s was such a political time, and we didn't kind of want to lose that thread. And then an artist that we were so excited to include in the opening show, and that the Johnson Collection has a fabulous example of her work, is the artist Alma Thomas, also an African-American artist working in the 60s and 70s. Her work has been in the White House. She may be familiar to you. That's her work, the Reddit painting on the right, and it's next to a painting by Cy Twombly. And Twombly, a great Southern artist, very well known, very canonized. I think we were excited to put Thomas in dialogue with Twombly, as if to kind of remind people that a lot of artists were making kind of tough, abstract paintings in the 70s. Also, the photograph on the left is Alma Thomas at her Whitney opening in 1972. And she was the first African-American artist to have a solo show at the Whitney. And one thing we really wanted to do with the collection, with the opening show, was kind of go back to our institutional history and go back to the pivotal moments, the kind of tough things we did in the institution's history, and kind of revisit those through the collection. And from the late 60s into the early 70s, we did a series of solo shows of African-American artists in our lobby gallery, many of them working abstractly. And so that was a kind of brave thing for us to have done at the time. And we, as I said, we went back to those lists of artists. We even made some acquisitions vis-a-vis those shows to kind of preserve that institutional history within the collection. And then we kind of, this is the contemporary floor. This is the fifth floor that spanned from about the 70s up to the present. And this was what greeted you when you came off the elevator. So the wallpaper you see there is made by the artist Donald Moffat, who was an AIDS activist. He made this work in the 80s, kind of in the midst of the AIDS crisis, at a moment where there was sort of not a lot of national acknowledgement of what was happening. The text says, "He kills me." And, the AIDS crisis hit the art world very hard, and it hit the Whitney hard. And so I think we wanted to acknowledge that history. And it was sort of a big deal decision for us to put this very political wallpaper in this place, and then to hang, this is a work by Barbara Kruger, We Don't Need Another Hero, kind of feminist artist using text in a kind of billboard-like way. This is a work that had actually functioned as a billboard early on. And Moffat had used his wallpaper. He'd papered it around New York in the 80s as kind of this guerrilla activism. So we felt like here we were using the Kruger, we were using the Moffat in kind of ways that were true to their own intention. And again, signaling when people came off of the elevators on the fifth floor that the 70s on has continued in the United States, and very visible in our collection, to be kind of a tough political moment. The final gallery in the show we titled End of Empire. And as I loosely mentioned before, we saw this constellation of works really post-September 11th on, and you can see the painting there by Keith Mayerson of the kind of very famous, very circulated photograph of the World Trade Centers being hit. We saw over the past 15 years a lot of artists really engaging in kind of the difficulties that the United States have been faced with, sort of this idea of a changed world order in many ways for the U.S. And I think we felt kind of, we talked about this a lot, was this kind of a dour note to end the show with, but I think we felt like it was so true to what was in the collection and to what artists seemed to have been engaged in a large way at this time, that it was sort of the right thing to end with. And it was something also, not unlike the political 30s work, that I noticed got picked up a lot. I was interviewed a lot to kind of talk about our decision to include this kind of tough content in the show. So the last thing I'll leave you with, this is an image from our recent ad campaign titled "You Can See America From Here." And it was a campaign, I think it's a really great tagline, and it actually was a tagline that our outside marketing team came up with. And I think it's a way for us to entice people to come to the museum. But the more I think about it, I've seen it as sort of a challenge to us as a museum, and a challenge in response to the opening show. And this idea that, as much as possible, we will need to kind of continue to expand the narrative, to include more people as American artists, to include kind of more ideas about what American art is, more narratives with American art, more names within American art. I mean, spending time at the Johnson Collection today, I see a lot of artists that I know we're interested in that are not in the collection yet, maybe because they were working in the South or, just artists we haven't stayed on top of. So I think this idea that you can see America from here, we will continue to push this idea of trying to complicate that story and really make the museum a kind of expansive view of what American art is, hopefully. So thanks so much for your time. I'm sorry that I went a little bit over, and I hope you will come visit Jan and I in New York soon. Thank you.
Jane and Jan, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us here tonight and traveling to Spartanburg. I feel so fortunate to have representatives from two of the foremost art institutions in America, if not the world, here with us, particularly a native son of Spartanburg. So thank you. I'd also like to thank Jennifer Evans and the Chapman Cultural Center for their hospitality in making this auditorium available for tonight's event. Jennifer has long been one of the primary champions of the cultural movement in Spartanburg, and to that we're all grateful for her. In light of Jan and Jane's remarks about making collections matter, whether those collections are public art museums established a century ago or smaller private enterprises seeking to make a contribution, I'm pleased to have this opportunity to make an announcement about increasing accessibility to fine art in relation to a new initiative the Johnson Collection is undertaking with the Spartanburg County Public Libraries. This spring, one of the collection's most iconic works, and certainly its largest painting, will be relocated to the library's headquarters on Church Street. The painting in question, The Battle of Gettysburg, Repulse of Longstreet's Assault, captures the drama of one of the most pivotal events in American history. Created by an Englishman who immigrated to this country, the monumental Civil War painting is not the story of a Northern victory or a Southern defeat. Rather, it's an epic visual record of the vast military scope, the unprecedented death, and the personal interaction between warring soldiers, all at once on a canvas that measures 20 feet wide. Presently on view at Advance America's downtown building, the painting will soon be housed in a new programming space currently under construction on the main library's second floor, a room that will be accessible to the community groups and the 500,000 patrons that visit the library annually. I'd like to thank our friends at the library, especially Director Todd Stevens, for their partnership on this project, and I invite you to visit the painting often once its installation is completed in May. Until then, I invite you to join us in the lobby for a reception honoring Jane and Jan and celebrating the vibrancy of Spartanburg's cultural community. Thank you.